Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this seminar, conference, webinar, whatever you want to call it, on what you see there, challenges for levelling up. It's actually a very convenient moment that the government launched its levelling up white paper 2 days ago. I'm afraid I can't claim that we have read all 400 pages, but we have done an awful lot of work in the run-up to this. Which is what a couple of my colleagues are going to present in a minute. A significant part of that has been as part of the IFS Deaton Review of Inequality, which we're very grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for having funded. And the first speaker is going to be Xiaowei Zhu, who is a co-author on that paper, looking at the geography of inequality and in particular what's happening in the labour market and why wages are so different across different parts of the country. So she's going to start by looking at that. And the second presentation is going to come from my colleague David Phillips, who has worked for years now on the distribution of public funding and spending across England and indeed across the UK, and how that varies by region and according to how well off those areas are. He's going to be the second presenter. If you have any questions, then please put them into the Slido app, which you should have a link to, and do vote up the questions that you like, because they're the ones that will float to the top of my screen. Xiaowei and David will speak for about 15 minutes each, so there should be a good amount of time for questions. But before they start, Mark Franks from the Nuffield Foundation I think wants to say a couple of words about Nuffield, their support for the Deaton review. I will go off screen now and leave it to Mark and then my two colleagues. You won't see me again until it comes to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I know people will be keen to get onto the findings from the research, but I wanted to say a few things about how we would think about putting this work into a wider context. I mean, first of all, I'd like to emphasise that the Nuffield Foundation is a proud supporter of the Deaton Review and of the work that we'll be hearing about today on spatial disparities, and indeed a lot of other relevant research carried out by the IFS. So the Nuffield Foundation is an independent charitable trust with a mission to advance social well-being, and we fund and support rigorous research and analysis which aims to change people's lives for the better. And one key motivation we have in doing this is understanding how the risks faced by people of different types can be mitigated or channeled in a positive manner by drawing on different sources of support. Now, of course, these can be financial and physical assets that people may draw on at different points in their life, such as money and income and wealth, but it also includes less tangible factors, such as practical and emotional support. And this support comes from a number of sources, such as through people themselves in the form of human capital and savings, for instance, the family, people's work, the state, and of course, the place and community that people live in. And these things are all connected, and some of the research that we'll be hearing about today is especially focused on human capital and work and vocation. And it demonstrates the deep challenges involved in meaningfully affecting the geographical distribution of outcomes in a sustained manner, and also doing so in a way that leads to a genuine improvement overall in outcomes. I mean, in the language of this week's white paper, it was talked about in terms of growing the pie rather than simply slicing it differently. And I think it's hard to overestimate the scale of that challenge. And the labour market is a key mediating factor that draws so many of the strands of geographical inequalities together. But there is a welcome recognition in the white paper that to truly level up, we need to look well beyond the labour market, and much other work supported by Nuffield does speak to these wider issues. So our early childhood programme has shown or highlighted further that marked regional and local differences in rates of child poverty exist and have implications for the welfare and life chances of people in different parts of the country, and these effects compound over time. We know that children in the most deprived 10% of neighbourhoods in the UK are 10 times more likely to be in care or on a child protection plan than children in the least deprived 10%. And research supported by us has shown that remote education during the pandemic showed differences between English regions in pupil and parental engagement in education, access to IT, and guidance provided by teachers. And other work supported by the Foundation is related to the very relevant topic of a successful local delegation of powers. And it's shown that this requires support from appropriate financial freedoms, but also the ability to join up local services in a holistic and strategic way. And work by the IFS has shown that local funding and financial support creates winners and losers, both at the individual and the local authority level. And that's determined by legacy factors rather than financial need. And it may be that David touches on some of that in his presentation. And true levelling up will need to address all of these problems. The Deaton Review of Inequalities is so named because it correctly recognises that it isn't possible to improve everybody's well-being by focusing solely on place or any other single aspect of inequality. And therefore, it's vitally important that efforts to reduce geographical disparities are supported by action to address other persistent inequalities in the UK, including in relation to age, gender, and ethnicity. And we must not lose sight of the fact that people everywhere should have a fair opportunity for a healthy life and good access to education, public services, and employment opportunities. It's also important to remember that national policies can affect regional and local outcomes, the national minimum wage being a good example of this. However, much as a sole focus on place won't address the UK's deep-rooted inequalities, nor is it possible to address them without an in-depth understanding of people's local context. And that's why this research is so important and so timely, and why the Nuffield Foundation is proud to be supporting it. And with that, I'll say thank you and hand over to Xiaowei.
Thanks very much, Mark. So I'll be talking about some recent work on geographical inequalities in the labour market. So the Levelling White Paper that was published on Wednesday put forward 12 missions to tackle different aspects of geographical inequality across the UK. And the first on the list was a mission to narrow gaps in labour market outcomes, so to improve pay, employment and productivity across the country, and to close gaps in these outcomes between areas with the aim of creating a globally competitive city in each region. Alongside this were other missions focused on improving educational outcomes in school, as well as increasing high quality skills training, especially in low skilled areas. So in this presentation, I'm going to provide some context to these levelling up missions. I'll start by talking about patterns of geographical inequality in pay and employment, how these have changed over time with a focus on geographical inequalities in wages. I'll then talk about the importance of education and skills in explaining the patterns of wage inequality that we see across the country, and therefore the importance of the skills and education missions to the success of the first mission. I'll end by saying some things about what we think this all implies for policy going forward. There are large differences in pay and employment across different parts of the UK. So on the left-hand map here, we see that average wages across the country ranged from just £13 an hour in places like Grimsby and Scarborough to £21 an hour in London. And we also see considerable differences in employment rates from 66% in some areas to 90% in others. Now you can see that the places that have low wages are not always those that have low employment rates, but there are some areas that fare poorly on both measures. Some particular places in the south of Scotland, the north of England, parts of Wales and parts of Lincolnshire. So focusing now on differences in average wages, we see that the distribution across the country is highly skewed. So there's a small number of places like London, Reading, Slough and Heathrow, Milton Keynes, that have average wages that are far above the rest of the country. These differences in average wages across areas are largely driven by differences at the top of the distribution. So in this map, in this chart, I'm ranking areas by their average wage, and I'm plotting the distribution of wages within each travel to work area. So the top of the grey area here shows how much someone in the top 10% of earners in each area earns per hour. And you see that the grey area rises steeply as you move to the right. So someone who's in the top 10% of earners in London earns almost twice as much per hour as someone who's in the top 10% of earners in Scarborough, which is the lowest wage region. In contrast, you see that the bottom of the distribution is pretty much the same everywhere. So the bottom 10% of earners earn about £8 to £9 in all parts of the country. Now, of course, the consequence of this is that wage inequality is also much larger in richer areas. These differences in average wages we see across areas are highly persistent over time. So in this chart, I'm plotting average wages in the 10 years before the financial crisis against average wages in the years after, in both cases normalized around the national average. And you see that whilst there's been a little bit of convergence over time, broadly speaking, the relative positions of places have remained unchanged for 20 years. A lot of the differences in average wages we see across areas reflects differences in skills. So these maps show that places that have high hourly wages on average also have a high graduate share. And indeed, this very simple measure of skills, the graduate share, already explains nearly half of the total variation in average hourly wages in 2019. So we can control for individual characteristics more finely beyond the simple graduate to non-graduate distinction and compare the differences in average wages across areas with differences in wages that can be attributed to the areas themselves, so controlling for individual characteristics. And we call these area effects. So we do this by following the same individuals over time as they move from area to area and seeing how their wages change upon those moves. We find that controlling for composition in this way dramatically reduces the variation in wages that we see. So in the post-Great Recession period, the difference in wages between the lowest wage region and the highest wage region was 43% when looking at average raw wages, but just 17% when looking at area effects. And when we exclude the outliers, the differences are smaller still. So the 6% figure here means that someone moving most of the way across the distribution from one of the lowest paid to one of the highest paid areas would expect a wage increase of just 6%. When we decompose the variation in average wages across areas that we see, we find that 64% of this variation reflects differences in average skills across areas, so differences in average individual characteristics, whereas only 10% reflects differences in area effects that can be directly attributed to the area itself. The remaining 26% reflects the fact that high-skilled individuals tend to live in more productive places. So there's a positive correlation between the area effect and the average individual effect in that area, which is what you see plotted in this chart. And in particular, this relationship is strongest at the top of the distribution. So there's a handful of areas with very high skilled individuals and very high local wage premiums. And this helps to explain why a small number of areas have wages that are far above the rest of the country. So we've seen that there are large and persistent differences in wages across the country, and that these mostly reflect differences in individual characteristics between areas. So the question really is, what drives geographical inequalities in skills? And we find that these differences reflect both differences in educational attainment across areas, as well as differences in the demand for skills, which affect where skilled people choose to live. So here we're using data from recent GCSE cohorts, and on the horizontal axis, we're plotting the share of kids who grow up in an area who then go on to become graduates by age 27. And you see that there's enormous differences in educational attainment across the country. So fewer than 1 in 5 kids who grow up in Grimsby and Wisbech will go on to get a degree by age 27, compared to more than 1 in 3 kids in London and more than 40% in places like High Wycombe and Tunbridge Wells. But this isn't the whole story, because patterns of graduate mobility further exacerbate these differences in educational attainment. So on the vertical axis, I'm grouping people by where they live at age 27 and plotting the share of graduates in these same cohorts at age 27. So if no one moved, then all these areas would lie on the 45-degree line here. But instead, what you see is that lots of places that start out with low levels of educational attainment further lose graduates through migration, whereas a number of cities, in particular London, that start out producing a high share of graduates further gain graduates through migration. So the overall effect is to increase geographical inequalities in skills. These patterns of graduate migration are partly driven by geographical differences in the demand for skills. So this map here shows that graduate jobs around the country are very concentrated in and around London, as well as a number of other cities. And this reflects agglomeration benefits, the benefits from sharing resources, sharing infrastructure, learning from each other that comes from people concentrating. And the evidence shows that the concentration of graduate jobs has increased in recent years, likely due to the shift towards a knowledge economy where agglomeration benefits are stronger, as well as declines in transport costs and communication costs, which allow people to concentrate more. Concentration in the demand for skills means that graduates from low-paying places are more likely to move away. That's what you see in the chart here. And they're more likely to move to places offering better pay, better opportunities. So the vertical axis here is the change in the graduate share due to migration. And you see that places that offer higher pay see a larger positive change due to graduate migration. So the fact that graduates are mobile means that the interaction between the supply of skills and the demand for skills is really important, because high-skilled firms will only locate in places where there's a pool of skilled individuals available, but high-skilled workers will move away unless there are high-skilled firms to employ them. And it's the self-reinforcing feedback loop that explains the persistence of geographical inequalities in labour market outcomes over time. And going back to the correlation I showed between the productivity of an area and the skills in an area, this is why high-paying jobs are concentrated in just a handful of areas. That said, it's worth noting that there are some places that manage to attract lots of graduates without having particularly high wages. And I think that points to the role of amenities as well in attracting high-skilled people. Of course, a flip side of an area being attractive to workers from elsewhere is that it pushes up house prices. And you see here that areas that pay a higher wage for a given type of individual also have higher rents for a given type of property. Because low-income households tend to spend a higher share of their income on housing, and because, as you recall, wages are pretty much flat across the bottom of the distribution everywhere, this means that lots of high-paying places actually have lots of poverty. So in particular, London is the region with the highest poverty rates in the UK. So I'll end by talking a bit about what we think these findings mean for policy going forward. So we find that most of the differences in wages across areas reflect differences in skills. So what this means is that to level up wages, we really need to level up skills. And it's good that the white paper acknowledges this. Put differently, this means that policies to improve wages in an area, so for example, by improving transport or concentrating R&D investment, won't have much of an effect on wages unless they manage to improve skills in that area, either by boosting educational attainment or by attracting high-skilled people from elsewhere. Now, the interaction between the supply of skills and the demand for skills means that we really need simultaneous action on both fronts. So if you just improve educational attainment in an area without creating high-skilled jobs, then those people will simply move elsewhere. But if you just create good jobs in an area without improving educational attainment, then high-skilled people from other places will move in, driving up house prices and not necessarily benefiting low-skilled residents. I think an implication of this is that we need to be realistic, given the scale of investment needed, given this need for simultaneous action on both fronts, as well as the reality of agglomeration benefits. It might not be realistic or even desirable from a productivity point of view to try to equalize labour market outcomes everywhere. And I think this is something that's acknowledged in the white paper when they talk about the need to create globally competitive cities in each region. So perhaps a more realistic focus is to focus on a couple of places outside London and try to really create a counterweight to London, trying to spare these self-reinforcing forces of demand and supply in those places, so that talented kids can access good job opportunities closer to home rather than moving all the way across the country to London. But I think there will be a tension between the economic goals set out in the Levelling Up paper, so this need to create globally competitive cities in each region, and some of the other missions set out in the white paper, so the desire to level up the quality of life and well-being across areas, for example, which I think will create pressure to spread investment more thinly across areas. So I think I'll end there and hand over to David.
Thanks, Xiaowei. Let me just share my screen. Great. So in this presentation, we'll look at recent trends and two of the most direct levers the government has to affect its aim of levelling up: taxes and public spending. As we noted on Wednesday, relatively little was said about either. Departments and public services will be expected to deliver on their very ambitious missions from within the budget set at the spending review last autumn. And it's unclear, except in a few specific instances, whether the fund will be redistributed to parts of the country where progress needed to achieve the 12 missions is greatest. Now, I can't tell you how much would need to be spent or where, but I can provide some context on three key issues which are relevant. First, the overall degree redistribution between England's regions through tax and public spending. We'll see different trends over the last 2 decades on the tax and spending side. Second, local government spending, where in the last decade at least, we'll see different types of trends across places and across people. And third, school spending, where the reality post-2010 contrasts somewhat with the rhetoric. So first, looking at the overall picture. Taken together, tax and public spending redistribute significant amounts of resources between England's regions. So this chart shows the effective fiscal transfer to or from each region of England in 2019-20. And this is calculated as the difference between a region's implicit budget surplus or deficit per person and the English average budget deficit per person. A negative figure is an area that effectively pays into the system. A positive figure is an area which receives the net transfer. And you can see only 3 regions had a surplus or deficit smaller than English average and hence paid into the system: London, the South East and East of England. The other regions had deficits larger than the English average and received net transfers of up to £3,800 per person from the system in the case of the North East. This pattern reflects that in general, revenues are lower and spending higher in poorer parts of England, although London is the exception with very high revenues, but also the highest levels of public spending too. Now, the scale of fiscal transfers between regions has increased over the last 2 decades. In real terms, London's net transfer into the system has increased by about £2,100 per person, roughly doubling since 2000. The net transfer to the West Midlands has increased by £1,500 per person, or more than doubling. So we have seen a sort of increase in the amount of redistribution from London and the South East to the other parts of England, especially the Midlands, actually. Now, this trend largely reflects the revenue side of the budget. And in particular, revenues per person in London, shown on the green line here at the top, have pulled away from the other regions of England. So, for example, the difference between revenues per person in London and the North East has increased from the equivalent of 54% of the English average to 69% of the English average. And this pulling away of London in terms of revenues reflects several factors, some of them in basically economic factors, London pulling away economically. So there's been particularly strong employment growth in London. There's been an increased concentration of the very highest income individuals in London, and particularly rapid property price growth in London. But also it reflects policy changes as well. So for example, income tax reforms have reduced taxes on lower earnings while increasing them on higher earners. Changes to stamp duty have substantially increased taxes at the top, somewhat reducing them in the long run at the bottom. On the spending side of the budget, though, if anything, there's been a convergence between the regions of England. So over the last 20 years, spending in the southeast and east of England has increased by more than the average for England as a whole. It's still lower than average, about 8% below average in the east, 6.5% lower in the southeast, but this gap is smaller than 20 years ago. Conversely, in the northeast and northwest, spending has grown less quickly. And while it's still higher than the English average, that is less true than 20 years ago. And these trends mean that the difference between spending in the northeast and east of England has narrowed from the equivalent of 25% of the English average in 1999-2000 to 17% in 1920. Now again, these trends will also reflect in part economic trends and changes in the overall composition of public spending. So for example, the gap in employment rates between the north and the southeast and southwest and east has narrowed, meaning entitlement to means-tested benefits is more evenly spread than it once was. And disability benefit receipt isn't quite as concentrated in the ex-industrial areas of the north as it once was, as you've seen a rise in the incidence of mental ill health, a fall in the incidence of sort of the share of disability benefits that relate to sort of physical ill health and disguised unemployment. Health and pension spending is also a bigger share of spending, and that has never been as concentrated in the north as some of the other areas of spending. But policy changes have also contributed to this, certainly over the last 10 years, not least in terms of what's happened to school spending and local government spending. So let's turn to local government spending and finances. There is significant redistribution to more deprived local authority areas, but less so than prior to the 2010s austerity. So this chart shows local government spending per person on services other than education, public health, police, and fire. And we exclude those because it's not possible to compare them fairly over time. And it looks at them by the decile group of deprivation level of the areas councils serve, with the most deprived councils on the left and the least deprived councils on the right. Here was the spending per person in 2009-10, it's first in 1920 prices. And here is the spend in 2019-20. And you can see that the 2010 saw cuts in council spending across England. But the cuts were large for councils serving more deprived areas, at 31% or £432 per person for the most deprived tenth, compared to 16% or £134 per person for the least deprived tenth. The biggest differences actually were for adults and children's social care, where spend per person increased in the least deprived areas, but fell 14% in the most deprived. Cuts were also larger in the north of England, and indeed London, actually, than the southeast and southwest. So for example, cuts averaged 30% in the northeast and 25% in the northwest, but just 15% in the southwest and 16% in the southeast. And this pattern reflects the fact that during the early to mid-2010s under the coalition government, it didn't account for how much different councils relied on the central government grant funding it was given to councils when it cut that grant funding. Now, this was a political choice, one which sort of contrasted from the rhetoric at the time. The government could have, and subsequently has, taken much more account of reliance on grant funding. And indeed, for the first time since at least 2010, next year is set to see a bigger funding increase for councils in poorer areas than richer areas, which, is that an indication that the levelling up agenda is being taken, at least somewhat seriously? But it is important to note that this small change will undo the previous pattern of cuts. I think an important point to note, though, is that within local authorities, spending is increasingly targeted on residents with the most acute needs, often living in the most deprived communities within those areas. So the most obvious manifestation of this is that the social care budgets have been relatively protected from spending cuts. And then within adult social services, for example, eligibility criteria have been tightened to only those with the highest needs. And within children's social services, for example, more universal Sure Start and youth services have been cut back, while spending on safeguarding and fostering, which often is to protect children, unfortunately, in the most deprived areas, that's increased significantly. But the pattern can also be seen for other services too. So, for example, while the overall housing budget has been cut by 50%, spending on homelessness and homelessness prevention is up by 70%. And within transport, spending on concessionary bus passes, for example, has been protected, while there's been much more raised from parking charges and cuts to other areas of the transport budget. The last point I'll make on local government funding is the necessity of reform. And this can be seen by the fact that when allocating funding during the pandemic and for the coming year, the government has still been using data from 2013-14 and formulas from the mid-2000s. And since then, the needs and revenue raising capacity of different areas will have changed significantly, not least because of changes in population. So, for example, the population is up over 20% since 2013 in Tower Hamlets, but down 2% in Blackpool. And those differences haven't been reflected in the funding formula used. Now, the government has recently been committed to updating these funding formulas and allocations as part of its fair funding review, but the scope of this review is still unclear. Although the white paper now has given us a date, it suggests the next few months we'll see announcements. Details will really, really matter on this, but also the principles. How is the government trading off one objective of it, which is to provide incentives for growth in local areas, with another objective is to target funding at needy areas. Those can be in conflict. How will the government trade those off? Now, I should say that at the IFS, we are hoping to help people make sense of these changes. We're going to examine the impact of the reforms when they're announced, and we're also going to make available an online tool for councils to analyse the impact on them and explore alternative reform options to aid in their financial planning and their consultation responses. So moving on to schools, the key headline here is that spending became significantly more targeted at the most deprived areas during the 2000s, but this reversed from about 2013. And you can see that on these charts, which compare levels of funding for schools according to the proportion of their children that are eligible for free school meals to the funding levels for the fifth of schools with the lowest levels of deprivation. So looking at the red lines here, you can see that funding per pupil for the fifth of primary schools with the most children on free school meals, so the most deprived intakes, increased from about 18% higher at the start of the millennium to 35% higher between 2007 and 2013. But by 2019, it had fallen back to just 23% higher than funding for the least deprived schools. And funding decisions since then mean a further fallback will have taken place. You can see on the right-hand panel, a similar pattern can be seen for secondary schools as well, with first an increased amount of funding of deprived schools during the 2000s and the early 2010s, and then a fallback since 2013. Now, what explains this? Well, there are two factors, really. In part, again, it reflects the same sort of problem that was seen for local government. It was a lack of updates to school funding formulas in a period of quite significantly changing patterns of deprivation, where London, for example, was becoming relatively less deprived and parts of the North and Midlands becoming more deprived. The funding formula didn't account for those changes. And the fact that government has introduced a new funding formula for schools should mean that such changes in deprivation patterns are now accounted for going forwards. But the choices made in relation to the new funding formula when it was all introduced have also contributed to the narrowing of the funding differentials. In particular, the introduction of minimum funding levels, which provide a guaranteed minimum amount for a school per person, that's benefited around 4/10 of schools with the least deprived pupils, but none among the most deprived. So what the introduction and the increase of this minimum funding level has done is therefore directly redistributed part of the school's budget from being available to more deprived schools to less deprived schools. And this does matter because in recent years, research has provided increasingly robust evidence that school funding really does matter for outcomes, and especially low SES students, with some research suggesting it's particularly true for the most able low SES students. Now, of course, the government did announce that there will be these opportunity areas, these targeted areas in the country where there will be, some additional resources to pay retention bonuses for kind of teachers. And the kind of question there is, first of all, how much funding is involved here? And also, how does it fit into the wider school funding environment? Is this funding within these areas going to be targeted at the most deprived communities? How is the funding to provide this additional support going to be reallocated from the rest of the school's budget effectively? That will matter a lot for the outcomes and the funding for deprived schools across the country. Okay, so let's sum up. The first thing I'd reiterate is the spending trends. Differences in spending across regions, and at least since 2010, local authority areas have narrowed. Now, the slower growth and then bigger cuts in spending in the north and the south is to at least some extent down to economic trends, where trends in unemployment and disability have contributed to those narrowings. But the bigger cuts to spending by poorer councils in the 2010s and what we've seen it for schools is, to a large extent, the result of policy choices. The second key takeaway is the importance of ensuring funding formulas are kept up to date and are based on relevant needs factors. Council funding formulas are hopelessly out of date, and the same was true of funding for schools until recently. But third, the design of funding formulas and funding allocations is an inherently subjective, indeed political exercise. For example, the choices made when introducing the new schools funding formula shifted funding from schools with more deprived pupils to those with more affluent pupils. And equally, the new formulas and allocations arising from the Council Fair Funding Review later this year will be as much a result of political decisions as technical analysis. And the decisions made on funding allocations are therefore a good test of the government's political commitment to the levelling up agenda. And with that, I'll end, and it's time for questions.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much, David. Thank you, Xiaowei. I hope those of you listening found that as fascinating as I did, even though for me it's the second time around, as we presented something similar actually to the Cabinet Office yesterday. There's quite a lot of questions, but please do add your questions still, and indeed vote up those that you are most interested in, because those are the ones I see first. Interestingly enough, the question at the top of the list, I think, is one that David actually answered in his presentation, that being how strong is the correlation between funding for education and positive student outcomes, whereas David said the most recent evidence suggests that funding really does matter, particularly for poorer students, and actually possibly particularly for the most able poorer students. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, David.
No, I think the thing I would add is that, I think this was kind of a bit of a sort of a controversial area until the last couple of years. I think, there's some influential work in the kind of 90s and early 2000s that suggested that funding didn't really matter that much, but actually more recent work using more robust sort of methods, both in the UK and in the US and other countries, really has shown that funding matters, and particularly resource funding. It's the funding for day-to-day spending, things like teachers, and the sort of resources available for teaching, more so than the capital side of the budget. Although, of course, you still need to make sure that schools are maintained and there's enough schools. But the sort of day-to-day funding seems to be more important than once the school's in place than funding to make the school as shiny and bright as possible.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's been an interesting change in a way over the last 20 years. I mean, I used to be in the Department for Education in the early 2000s, and then the real worry about teachers was getting teachers into London. Now the real worry is getting them into a lot of these more deprived and often coastal areas. The geography of the country, whilst in a lot of the statistics, it's hard to see massive change. You can see it in some of those sorts of ways, and thinking about how to respond to that is a real challenge going forward. There's a couple of questions here about London specifically. Doesn't just focusing on London as a travel to work area miss out the huge inequalities? And did I hear right, London has the highest poverty rate? To which I think the answer in both cases is yes. London is the most unequal region of the UK by some distance. We have very large numbers of very high income and high wealth people in London. To get into the top 1% of the distribution in London, you need to be earning, I can't remember the number, but several hundred thousand.
£7 an hour, yeah.
Sorry, what was that, Joey?
Sorry, go ahead.
You need to be earning several £100,000 a year to get in the top 1% in London, and only about 100,000 a year to be in the top 1% in Wales, for example. And yet there are also high levels of economic inactivity. And as Xiaowei showed, the bottom 10% of earners in London don't earn a great deal more than the bottom 10% of earners anywhere else in the country. So huge inequality in London, very significant poverty, particularly after housing cost poverty, given the costs of housing. But Xiaowei, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's all right. There is a huge amount of inequality within London. And that stems from the fact that whilst rich people are very spatially concentrated, very much concentrated in London, poor people are spread pretty much evenly everywhere. And the combination of flat wages at the bottom of the distribution across areas and high housing costs in London means that poverty is very high in London. That said, we chose to focus on travel to work areas as our unit of analysis because we're interested in labour market outcomes. So we think that travel to work areas are the appropriate unit to capture the labour market opportunities that you have, so the types of jobs you can access. So we have a nice line in the report that notes that, so I live in Peckham, and my co-author Henry Overman lives in Dulwich, which is, a 5-minute cycle away, and it's a much richer area. And if we just wanted to look at differences in incomes between these areas, it would be huge. But, the types of jobs we can access are pretty much the same, right? So I think when we're looking at labour market outcomes, it does make sense to focus on travel to work area differences.
Yeah, I reflect when I first moved to London many years ago, Peckham was significantly less salubrious than it is even today. There's another question here about education. It says the mission is that 90% of students should reach the expected standard in primary school by 2030. In 2019, it was only 65%, and indeed, no region, not even the very top local authorities like Richmond and the City of London, were reaching 90% meeting expected levels in reading, writing, and arithmetic by age 11. So this does look like an extremely stretching target. I think it would be fair to say an important target. I mean, one of the things I find, in a sense, most shocking about our education system is if you don't reach the expected levels in those core subjects at age 11, you've got close to a zero probability of getting 5 good GCSEs, including English and maths, at age 16. And we have no recognised alternative route to success for that group of pupils. But again, David or Xiaowei, do you want to add to my ramblings on that issue?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I would say on this is, clearly there's sort of two areas the government's trying to really make progress. Well, there's 12 missions, but there are two that sort of link up with education, the labor market. There's sort of the pay and employment and productivity objectives, which are at a regional level. And then there are the school attainment objectives, which are at a local level. And I think the kind of one potential risk of that is, it kind of makes sense. You can't have, well, it's very challenging to have a setup where, high-skilled, high-paid jobs are equally spread across every single town and district of the country. But if some areas have, some like peripheral parts of regions don't have good jobs in the areas, you might see an outflow of university-educated people from those areas. That might make it harder for the next generation of children to succeed in school, because we know how important parents' education is for their children's life chances. That doesn't mean that, we should give up on those areas and the children there. You need to invest more in those areas as, the circumstances of the families in them are more challenging. But I think that it could be, if the government is willing to see, certain areas lose lots of the graduates to kind of regional hubs, that might make it harder for them to level up the educational attainment of the next generation of children, given how important we know that, or how strong the link is between parents' education and their children's outcomes is.
But I think maybe there's a bit of a tension between trying to level up outcomes between areas and trying to level up opportunities for people in areas, right? So if you have a model in which you create a couple of big hubs outside London that allows, talented people from left behind areas to move to those places, say move to Leeds rather than moving all the way to London, you're massively benefiting talented kids in Leeds, even if they do leave. And, that means that the overall education level in Leeds falls. So I think that's a situation in which you are leveling up opportunities for people across the country, even if you're not leveling up absolute outcomes. And I guess there's a tension in how the government wants to define, its ultimate aims. It sort of relates to this whole people versus place debate as well. Are you trying to improve outcomes for people, or are you just trying to say, we want all parts of the country to look similar? I think on the education point, I think a broader point I'd make is that these missions are all massively ambitious, right? The education one is a good example of that. I mean, we're trying to go from 65% to 90% overall, let alone leveling up places within the UK. And I think it's so striking that there's only two places in the UK, I think there was City of London and Kensington, I think, that currently have levels above 80%. So trying to go to 90% overall is just a remarkably ambitious target. It's not just education. The health targets are also extremely ambitious for the entire country. So the aim was to, I think, increase healthy life expectancy by 5 years by 2035. Now, healthy life expectancy has not gone up at all since about 2009, and I think for women has actually fallen slightly. So to absolutely reverse that trend in the coming decade, I think is also ambitious to the point of being unrealistic. So yes, I think it comes from the fact that the white paper has both set absolute targets as well as relative targets, right? Targets to improve outcomes overall across the whole country, as well as to narrow gaps within the country.
Great. That's a fascinating discussion. I think this issue about targets and how ambitious it is sensible for them to be is one. It is very reminiscent of the New Labour years when there are a number of very ambitious targets, which and government would have defended as saying that the ambition was important in terms of getting the system to stretch itself as hard as it possibly could. But it is an interesting, almost back to the future sense for some of us who lived through those times of ever expanding numbers of targets. It's quite nice to see to some degree exactly what it is that government is focusing on through these missions. But I certainly agree with the tone of the questioner and indeed what Xiaowei and David were saying, that some of these targets are very, very stretching indeed. Now, there's a number of questions here about the levelling up fund, or the the replacement of European regional funds. So there's a particular one about the impact on, mentions Flintshire in Wales, when they received no money from Community Renewal Fund. What will they get from the Levelling Up Fund? And I'd be grateful for some assessment of the Levelling Up Fund in Wales specifically, and implications this may have for the Union. And I think there's another one which I can't now see, which was also specifically about the way in which government is replacing the European funds. David, do you want to briefly have a go at that, and perhaps with a small detour into Wales, since a couple of—
I can do. So I'll start with the Welsh one, and then I'll start with I think the kind of very controversial issue at the moment, which is like the scale of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Is it big enough to replace the EU funds? Well, I'll explain why the answer is I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think the answer is necessarily no. So on the first part about Wales, I think I kind of make 2 points here. So I think there's kind of, there's a kind of question about, it's being posed really. There's a BBC article on this and claims in Wales that Wales is being shortchanged, if you like, by the Levelling Up agenda. And I think my answer to that is, if you think about the funding that's being provided to Wales, in some areas, actually, one could argue that Wales is getting more than its fair share. In other areas, one could potentially argue that it's not getting its fair share. So let me explain why. So in terms of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, that aspect of the Levelling Up funding, what the UK government has said is that the allocations for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Cornwall will at least match the allocations they got. And that matters because under the EU funding regime, West Wales and the Valleys, one of the poorest areas, benefited from a rule which substantially, gave much, much more to areas that have below 75% of the EU average GDP than areas just above it. So West Wales and the Valleys and Cornwall, for example, got about 4 to 6 times as much as areas like Teesside and Lincolnshire and South Yorkshire, which are just a little bit richer. East Wales also got about twice as much as other areas with similar levels of GDP per capita, East Wales being, substantially better off part of Wales. Those are being protected when the government introduces the Shared Prosperity Fund. And, from an objective perspective, it's kind of hard to, see why, there should be such a big difference between West Wales and the Valleys and areas just a bit richer, and such a big difference between East Wales and areas similar. So I think on the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, potentially one could argue that, Wales, at least in the short term, would get more than its, fair share of that funding, continuing the sort of allocations of the EU funding, which are a bit difficult to justify in my view. On the broader kind of funding for Levelling Up, for schools, for local government services, for public health, things like that. If funding within England is just being reallocated from the richer to the poorer areas, well, Wales would get nothing because the Barnett formula is based on the total spending in England. And even though Wales would be one of the poor, would be down there with the poorest areas of England, because it's just being money reallocated within England, Wales gets nothing. Even if it's new money for England and for these deprived areas of England, the Barnett formula gives Wales 1.05 times its population share, but a needs-based assessment would probably mean more than that. So I think in this kind of more general, public spending side of things, there really is potentially an issue where Wales is losing out compared to what it would get if it was treated like a region of England for public spending. That really opens up the kind of question about, we've got this Barnett formula, has nothing to do with needs. What is that doing in the system? I mean, effectively it's in the system because politics means it's too difficult to get rid of. But from a sort of objective perspective, I think there's a sort of, an issue there for Wales in particular. Scotland, I think, would lose out if they were to change that system. On the issue about, will the EU funding replace, will the UK Shared Prosperity Fund replace the EU funding that has been lost? I think a lot has been made of the fact that, the EU funding was about, for the core regional development funding was about £1.5 billion a year. And the UK funding, over the next couple of years, it's only ramping up to 1.5 billion, and then the first couple of years is much less than that. I think that's kind of, forgetting the fact that EU funding allocations were always spent with a lag. So we're still spending some EU money now, and the UK money is going to kind of phase in as that EU money phases out. So on that basis, potentially the UK government is matching the funding from the EU. The big question for me, and I've not got an answer to this, is whether this 1.5 billion pounds, which would be enough to replace the EU's kind of main development funding, is that also meant to cover what was provided by the Common Agricultural Policy for rural development? That was about another 700 million pounds a year, which I've not seen mentioned in the government statements about the Levelling Up Fund or anything else. If that money isn't being replaced by another method, this 1.5 billion pounds won't replace all the EU funding that's been lost with Brexit.
Great. Well, thank you, David. A very comprehensive answer. I mean, there's so much to say on all of that, and David is very much the oracle. Last couple of minutes, so a couple of questions for you, Xiaowei. They've been voted right to the top. One is about distinguishing between university education as a proxy for skills and actual skills. Are we making a mistake by focusing too much on numbers of graduates, and should we be looking at who's actually got the skills that you need to earn decent money? And a completely separate one, but it is an important one, and you've got 2 minutes to answer both these questions, I'm afraid. Is there a relationship between gender inequality in an area and policies you might do to level up?
Both good questions. On the university proxy question, so when we do the analysis to look at how much of average wage inequalities between areas are due to differences in characteristics, we don't just use university as a proxy. So we focus on all characteristics that can affect wages. But in the analysis that looks at migration in particular, we use university education as a proxy for high-skilled people, and that's because in the data, that's one of the only proxies that we can use. So I think when we say that the vast majority of differences in average wages across areas are driven by differences in skills, that's not just using university as a proxy. The gender question is really interesting and not one that I had thought about before. I mean, I actually think, I don't know this, but I would imagine that gender inequalities in labour market outcomes in particular are particularly high in cities like London and maybe places like Birmingham as well. And that's because women's earnings are lower among certain ethnic groups, which are concentrated in some cities. So my guess is if you were to focus on levelling up places with large gender inequalities, you would actually be directing money to London.
Mm. I actually know some of the stats on there that actually, yes, the gap between men's and women's wages tends to be lower in places like the Northeast and Wales, where the public sector is a bigger employer and wages are relatively high in the public sector, and obviously more women work in the public sector than men, and also where there are more unskilled men who have particularly done badly in labour market terms. Their position has relatively declined in recent decades.
Exactly. And also we know that the gender wage gap is largest among the most highly skilled. So again, that points to gender wage gaps being particularly high in London.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to have to stop there. I mean, one final thought on that last question is it'll be interesting to see what happens as a result of the movement to more working from home. On one side of the coin, that should help women who often, particularly after childbirth, will stop commuting so far and move to much lower paid jobs closer to where they live to fit around childcare. So you'd have thought more working from home would help the gender pay gap and indeed some of the regional pay gaps. But on the other side of the coin, there's also rather strong evidence that for people who are in an organisation, people who work at home a lot are less likely to be promoted than those who go into the office more. But anyway, there was a huge number of additional questions which you just haven't had time to get through. But I think all of that indicates the continuing interest in this area. We at the IFS are going to continue to work in all of these areas to do with inequality, including and in particular geographic inequalities. But thank you ever so much to Xiaowei and to David for some great presentations and answers to the questions. And thank you to everyone for listening.